It's a pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Melissa Rosenkranz. Melissa is an associate scientist at the Center for Investigating Healthy Minds at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She therefore is colleagues with John here and Helen, formerly of the same institution. Melissa has done some remarkable work harnessing the ability to control many of the contextual factors that arise common in mindfulness-based interventions, particularly in MBSR. And I've had the pleasure of seeing your career flourish over a long period of years and working in the Davidson umbrella.
20.
Almost 20 years. Mm-hmm. So I was 14, so you way beat me. And so she's going to give us a talk that, after active controls and meditation studies, where's the beef?
Thanks for that introduction, Cliff. I don't think I ever thought I would find myself giving a talk with beef in the title. But I can thank Cliff for that one, too. Thank you, Cliff. I'm going to talk today about the body of research that compares training in meditation to active comparison conditions. Really, I think for maybe the first time giving a talk, I'm going to be presenting almost no data. But I'm happy to talk about the data in the discussion period if people want to hear more about it. So over the past 20 or so years, or at least as long as I've been doing this work, there have been many studies that have compared training in meditation to active control conditions. And when I say meditation training here, I'm going to be using fairly interchangeably the words meditation training, mindfulness, and MBSR. I know that, that there are vast chasms between some of the definitions of those words, but for the purposes of the talk today, just bear with me and consider them roughly equivalent. And I also want to note that still today, the overwhelming majority of research that investigates the impact of meditation training or MBSR compares it to waitlist control groups or to treatment as usual. And that's not what I'm talking about today. The work that I'm going to talk about doesn't address the efficacy of meditation training. What the question here really is does training in meditation differ from other types of training that legitimately is designed to promote well-being? They're subtle but different questions, so just keep that in mind. And I'm not going to talk about that research today. So we can talk about that later and argue about it later, but that really isn't the purpose of my talk today. So among the more common active comparison interventions include relaxation training, various types of exercise interventions, health education or discussion type groups. And an active comparison intervention that we've developed at the UW-Madison takes aspects of all of these and sort of combines them into one. And of those who have used these types of active comparison interventions, many find that on the primary outcome measures that they set out to be interested in, they don't find group differences, often because both groups improve. Now, there are always going to be cases where we do find outcome measures that do show improvement that's specific to MBSR, including in our own studies, but I'm not going to talk about those either. What I'm going to talk about is the large number of studies that don't find differences and why that might be. So in the time that I have today, I'll talk about, again, the reasons why I believe that these studies fail to differentiate MBSR from active control conditions, and I'll also offer some recommendations for what I think that we can do better in the future of this research. So the first reason that often comes to mind when people think about this question is, of course, the active comparison interventions are implicitly or unknowingly training mindfulness. And I'm going to take a pretty firm stand here that I do not believe that that is what is happening here, at least in our hands. I've attended these classes myself, And the instructors, at least in our interventions, are not implicitly training mindfulness any more so than any random aerobics instructor or spinning instructor or somebody teaching a cooking class or a music class is implicitly training mindfulness. Obviously, any activity can be an object of meditation. And in those who have some natural proclivity for mindfulness or some prior training, that could happen, but that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about implicitly training mindfulness, and I do not believe that that is happening, at least in our research. And I've been involved in all of the active comparison interventions that have happened in the Davidson laboratory anyway, at UW-Madison. Another possibility, whoops, I forgot to advance that, sorry. Another possibility, and one that I believe is much more likely, and this has been touched upon by several of the previous speakers, is that the reasons why we're failing to differentiate these groups has more to do with common factors. And what I mean by common factors are things that we know improve well-being that are part of any legitimate intervention that have nothing to do with the specific intervention itself, but they have to do with things that are common to many different types of interventions, including the group interaction that's inherent in the way that these interventions are delivered, the social support that comes along with meeting as a group, the attention and guidance of expert and skilled instructors, particularly ones that are charismatic in and of themselves. And a third and important factor is the mere act of taking time out of one's busy life to do something for yourself that you believe is going to improve your well-being. Belief is a very strong agent of change. As we heard talk about in the placebo research, this has been demonstrated for years that simply believing that what you're doing is going to have a positive effect can manifest aspects of that positive effect. I'm not suggesting that MBSR or the active comparison interventions are all placebo effect, but it's important to recognize that belief is a very strong agent of change. I also wanted to note that when we developed the health enhancement program, which is what our active comparison intervention was called, we designed it specifically to match MBSR in the factors that we thought are common, are these common factors that promote well-being in a more general way. So as this map of the London Underground illustrates, there are many ways to get to the same place. And perhaps another reason why these groups look the same is that in the early stages of any legitimate intervention, that place may be the same or may be very similar. And perhaps it's only with a long-standing period of practice or with intensive periods of practice that the benefits of any intervention that are unique to it are going to begin to improve. You can imagine somebody who just starts out on a running paradigm at first. The benefits that they get may be elevation in mood. Well, that's not specific to running. And it may be only after a period of 6 months or so where you start to see the muscles in their legs change and you start to see their cardiovascular system change. Similarly here, we may not be measuring the time course that we would need to really detect the things that are unique to any specific intervention, especially after 8 weeks of a relatively mild introduction to a technique like this. So the gentlemen in this image may appear to be identical twins, but they're actually complete strangers. And a third possibility here is similarly MBSR or meditation practices and the active comparison groups may only appear to produce the same benefit because we're not measuring what is unique about them. Like Play-Doh, which was actually originally designed as a cleaner for wallpaper, our experimental designs and our choice of outcome measures have often been repurposed from other domains of research. In those domains of research, we're not targeted specifically at what we expect to change as a result of a meditation practice, and for good reasons. This is a very new field of research. In any new field of research, it's important to situate the information that you're collecting within an existing and well-founded experimental structure, both for the field to be able to sort of get some purchase on it and have an existing theoretical framework within which to think about it, and to, I think it's just a good way to get traction and to buy credibility from others in the field about this new area of research. Another reason is practical. It's efficient. It is much easier to take existing tasks and experimental paradigms and employ them for a new question than it is to develop new tasks and to validate them and to pilot them and to develop the processing pipelines for that new data. And let's be frank, we're not given funding to develop new measures. And when that funding comes in the door, we need to hit the ground running. And so it's much easier and faster to repurpose other designs. And that always happens in new areas of research, but maybe it's time to move on from that. Those comparing MBSR to active control groups have primarily repurposed experimental designs from two existing areas of experimental research, one being those looking at attention and executive function, and the other being those investigating emotional processes, so emotional reactivity, emotional recovery, emotional regulation. And unfortunately, repurposing doesn't always work out as well as it did for Plato. This logo was an attempt by the science fiction channel to reinvent itself or repurpose itself. And unfortunately, what they didn't realize is that this new spelling that they chose is also slang for the word syphilis. So I don't think that we failed as badly as they did here. At least I hope not. And I think that there are perhaps different reasons why the repurposing of designs from these two existing areas of research may have failed in some respects. And I'm not going to talk about the reasons why I think it may have been less successful for the attention and executive network designs. We can talk about that later if you want. I'm more familiar with the emotion processing realm. And as I alluded to earlier, I think that any novel intervention that one sets aside time for, believes in, and fully engages in is likely to show benefits in this domain. There are examples of this in the literature for exercise interventions, for time spent in nature, for learning to sing, for emotional disclosure, massage. All of these have shown benefits, general benefits in psychological and physical well-being. So my recommendation here is that I believe that it's time that we move toward a more specific experimental designs that are designed precisely to detect changes that we would expect to see in response to meditation training, and importantly, to seek the input of people with a lot of experience with these techniques and from Buddhist scholars who can perhaps help us in designing experiments that are more precise and in interpreting the data that we get from those experimental designs. A fourth possibility for why we're failing to differentiate these groups, I know I love this picture, is the problem with random assignment. So in the real world, we get to choose activities for which we're best suited, for the most part anyway. And while random assignment is very important scientifically, it sort of ignores the fact that choice is also very important, both for motivation and for persistence. And while everybody probably can do the activities that comprise an MBSR intervention, those who are drawn to it or have some aptitude for it are much more likely to practice and engage in it, to persist in it after the intervention ends, and maybe more likely to benefit from it. You can imagine that if you love to run and you hate to swim, and you sign up for a study that's looking at the benefits of exercise, and you're assigned to the swimming group, you may be willing to swim for the part, for the study, the good of the study, but you're probably going to do it kind of begrudgingly. And after the study's over, you're probably not going to keep swimming if you're not a good swimmer and you don't like to swim. And so we may be shooting ourselves in the foot here. Similarly, in the real world, this has been talked about as well, and I'm really glad that others have expounded upon it more than I will here. Meditation practice generally has the support of a sangha, which is chosen and is not assigned as it is in the studies that we're conducting here. It gives a context and a normalcy to meditation practice that does not have cultural roots in the West, and it supports skill development and practice and persistence, which are important if we want to detect effects that are smaller than the whopping effects that we might see or that we are not seeing. So my recommendation here is that I think it's going to be really important moving forward in this research to compare individuals who've been randomly assigned to MBSR interventions to those who've freely chosen it, who show up at the door of their own accord, or at least to have experimental studies that are recruiting people who have chosen it, whether or not you compare them to those who've been randomly assigned or not. A fifth possibility for our failure to differentiate these groups is that the assumptions that are inherent in the way that we analyze our data may not be valid in all cases. So what we see here is a figure showing the relationship between amygdala recovery from negative emotional images and lifetime hours of practice in individuals who we are considering long-term meditators. And these individuals have a mean of about 9,000 hours of meditation practice. The range was somewhere from about 1,500 to 33,000. And what this shows is a relatively modest relationship where lifetime hours of practice predicts modestly better amygdala recovery from negative images. However, when we look at the amygdala recovery from negative emotional images in our non-meditating community volunteers, what we see, first of all, is that the means of these groups don't differ. The second thing that we see is that it's only at about 15,000 hours of practice that the mean for the long-term meditator starts to drop below the mean of the community volunteers. So does that mean that it takes 15,000 hours of meditation practice to show any benefit? What it could mean, well, there are a few things that it could mean. I'm going to talk about two today. The first is that perhaps people who are drawn to meditation are drawn to it because they are experiencing significant suffering. This is not my idea. There are common reports of this in history. Some of you may be familiar with who this woman is. Her name is Deepa Ma. And though she was drawn to the Dharma at an early age, she did not begin to learn meditation practice until she was in her late 40s. And she did so because she was experiencing immense suffering. She had 2 babies die in infancy, and she lost her husband in a relatively short period of time. And the extent of the grief that she was experiencing was so intense that she developed very serious cardiovascular disease. And to the point where she was actually bedridden for a long period of time. And she eventually got to the point where she believed that she was either going to die or she was going to learn to meditate. And she chose to learn to meditate and became a very adept meditator and meditation teacher. Similarly, Mingyur Rinpoche, who some of you may be familiar with, began to meditate out of a debilitating anxiety disorder. These are common themes that we hear here. So of note, and this is a little bit of a sidebar, is that these things that I'm talking about are often exclusion criteria in the randomized trials that we're using. And this may have the unintended consequence of leaving us with both a supernormal community control group to which we're comparing our long-term meditators, and it may that the supernormal control group doesn't reflect the general population. And it may reduce motivation to practice for those that are randomized to an MBSR class. If we're removing the people from our sample that are significantly suffering, what does that mean? What are we comparing them to? We're comparing them to people with a relatively small amount of suffering. Well, if people are showing up because they're suffering, we're not looking at this, we're not asking the same question anymore. So my recommendation here is that perhaps we start collecting retrospective data from individuals of early life adversity and including that information in our data analysis somehow, and perhaps we reconsider our exclusion criteria for some of these studies. It's also possible that when people show up at the door for these MBSR interventions, they arrive, they're fairly functional, doing pretty well, doing what they're supposed to be doing, only to fall apart when they start to experience the distress of confronting difficult emotions and painful behavioral patterns. In fact, in our own research, we find that people often make major life changes where they go through divorce and major career changes that are very painful at first in the moment. They may have long-term consequences that are better, but perhaps it's only through a sustained practice that those pieces start to come together again to form something new. And in some respects, it's this falling apart is precisely the goal. It depends on what you mean by falling apart, but sort of reconsidering what our life means in a different context. In my own experience in meditation retreats, I've often heard people ask the question of their teachers about progress on the path. And the most common, in fact, I think that this is probably the only answer that I've ever heard a teacher give, is that number one, the path is not linear, and number two, time is not a factor. Yet we analyze our data as if it is linear. In fact, we're applying the general linear model to our data. And so we need to start being more creative about this, maybe being more nuanced and sophisticated in the models that we use to analyze our data, and also to find better ways to assess progress. That is a tricky one, I will give you, but some of the ways in which we've started to do that in our lab are by getting reports from teachers, the participants' teachers, to get some indication of where they think an individual started and where they're going. In addition, we have begun to get reports from the significant other of the participants, so a spouse, a life partner, a close family member, somebody with intimate knowledge of that person, to say, how is this person in the world? How are they engaging in the lives of other people, as a way to assess how these teachings are affecting them. And so with that, I will leave you with gratitude, and the gratitude of all the people who make these conversations possible. These are the people in my lab. And thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you so much, Melissa.
Is there time for questions?
There's time for some questions. We're running a little late, so we won't have too many, but we'll have time for some.
Do you believe that there are gifted meditators, or would you say that there are people who are gifted meditators and people who are less gifted meditators?
I have absolutely no expertise in answering that question. My belief, if you want to know my belief, I think just like there are gifted runners and people who probably shouldn't run, I think that probably is the case for any activity that you're going to do, but I really don't have any basis for knowing that.
It's just one more variable.
Aptitude? Yeah.
We do have some senior meditation teachers in the room. Perhaps you want to make a comment on, are there gifted meditators, Sylvia?
It's a wonderful question. Because it depends very much on what meditation people would be doing that would be gifted. The question of that some people are more gifted at than others. The development of very focused attention seems to be easier for some people than for other people. If that were the only guideline for contemplative practice, then that would be one criteria. But the ability to relax the mind might not have to do with the ability to be particularly one-pointed in one's focus. The ability to be sensitive to nuance, I think, is different from one person to the next. Mm-hmm. Introspective with really a sensitivity to nuance and changes and an interest in it, which some people seem to have more keenly. Something akin to a poetic sensibility that some people have more than others. It depends on what kind of meditation practice you're doing for what particular outcome, what it is that you're training. Mm-hmm. But it's a wonderful question, enough for a whole day of discussion at least.
Thanks. That was first a great talk, I think, about some of the pitfalls with active control groups. I have two kind of question comments. One of them is, I think you kind of began to get at this, but how much do you think one of the issues is that we suffer from believing some of our own hype about how effective mindfulness interventions are and are looking for effect sizes that are in comparison to an active control group, not necessarily realistic. The second thing is, one of the reasons we use active control groups, at least in some studies, for example, with health outcomes, is to see whether the mindfulness practice actually adds something beyond what you get in the active control group, like the social support and interaction. Mm-hmm. At what point do you think it's not just about pitfalls, but maybe in the active control group, but when do we actually conclude that this actually doesn't do more than an active control group?
Well, that's a tricky question. Getting to the first thing that you alluded at, which is power, it depends on the range of measures that you're collecting. So in the work that we do, often what gets these studies funded is the neuroimaging. And studies that are powered for neuroimaging are very different than studies that are powered for behavioral outcomes. And because of budget issues, we generally power our studies for the neuroimaging because that's what gets us the money in the first place, which means that the other measures like self-report, like behavioral, reaction time type studies, that sort of thing, are vastly underpowered. So when we don't find effects in that, it doesn't mean that there aren't effects there. It's that they were never powered to detect those effects in the first place. So I think that's an important consideration. Getting to your other question about when do we just decide that it's not any better, I think that goes to something that, Sylvia, you alluded to in the comment that you just made, which is that it's not a one-size-fits-all game here. I think that there are going to be some people that benefit a lot, some people that benefit a little, some people who it may even be harmful for, which Willoughby maybe we'll talk about later. That then becomes a clinical decision or an individual decision if you want to go to some of the things that Kathy was talking about in terms of what does it feel like for you when you're meditating? Does it help? If you want to talk about these large studies, these clinical trials, I think that what is probably going to happen is we're going to find some things that do tend to have replicability and do tend to show benefits from MBSR. Some of the inflammatory measures have been replicated, and those seem to be a little bit more consistent than some of the other measures. That may start to tell us what, if we want to go and talk about large populations of people who might be most likely to benefit from these practices based on certain qualities. But I don't know the answer to when we should just call it quits and say they're not different.
Don't take this the wrong way.
You start all your comments that way.
The question is, why do you care? As long as it's the case that each of these various kinds of treatment are producing some benefit relative to a passive control that gets no treatment at all, then everybody wins. What's in it for showing that there is some special extra beef which goes along with mindfulness training compared to all the other four that you mentioned as well? Shouldn't we just be happy that they all have their benefits, and we still can be concerned about for which people are each of these types of treatment the most appropriate? We got to worry about the person-treatment interactions, but to then try to go ahead and show one is generally superior to the others, I don't see why it matters.
Well, it does matter. It matters because people are recommending these practices to their patients. It matters because people are spending a significant amounts of their time and money on these, and it matters in the same way that it matters if echinacea really does decrease your chance of getting a cold. We may not care if echinacea makes you feel better. Great, take it. But there is the fundamental question of, does it provide benefit, and should we keep spending our resources on that? And so I do think that the question has value of, is there something unique about it? I wouldn't use the word better. I would say, is there something unique? Are there some types of suffering for which this is a better antidote than exercise? And I think there are. I think, we can have a conversation about personal beliefs there, but I do think that they're valid questions to ask.
You kind of answered it. I was just replying to the last question, that also to me, active control groups are not necessarily to prove that mindfulness is better than the other ones, but I think using an active control group probably is helpful in isolating active ingredients, and therefore just see how it is different and help answer the question of why it might work for some people and not others. Yeah.
Precisely.
The notion of active ingredients would be good fodder for the discussion section. Let's have a coffee break. Thank you so much, and thank Melissa.